Distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to have you in the Turkey launch of the UN Trade and Development's UNCTAD World Investment Report 2025. We congratulate our colleagues at UNCTAD again for the extensive efforts in preparing this report and appreciate making this launch possible right after its global launch. Today we have YASED Chairperson Tolga Demirözü and Head of the Investment Research Branch of UNCTAD, Richard Baldwin, with us. He is responsible for the preparation of this invaluable piece that is setting the base for related strategies and research, focusing on FDI trends and flows around the world, and also with a focus on regions and countries, as well as specific topics that are crucial for the world's development agenda, and this time it is digital economy. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our chairperson to open up the session. Tolga Bey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Serkan Bey. Thank you for the organization. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed members of YASED, representatives from government, international institutions, academia, and the press. It's an honor to welcome you to Türkiye launch of UNCTAD's World Investment Report 2025. This annual event is actually cornerstone of our commitment to fostering informed dialogue and strategic collaboration in advancing Türkiye's economic landscape. And today, we gather to explore this year's theme, International Investment in Digital Economy, a topic of a critical importance for our nation's competitiveness and as well as integration to the global market. For many years, as YASED, we enjoyed a robust and enduring partnership with United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and we deeply value UNCTAD's global perspective and evidence-based analysis, which serves as an intellectual cornerstone of our work. And the World Investment Report is actually more than a publication. It is a vital resource that enriches our understanding of the economic trends and also their implication for the Turkey's business environment. And through the insights, we gain clarity on how international flows create an opportunity for Turkey. And this valuable collaboration empowers YASED to provide our members a cutting-edge research and analysis, enabling them to navigate in the complexities of the current global market. And the theme of this report, this year's report, the digital economy, underscores a transformative force of reshaping the global competitiveness. And as YASED, we recognize that the digital economy is not just a trend, but moreover a fundamental driver of the innovation, efficiency, as well as the growth. And our members, leading global companies with a great experience and innovation capacity, plays a pivotal role in advancing Turkey's digital ecosystem. Through their investments, they enhance technology penetration, empower suppliers to adopt and develop cutting-edge technologies, and also drive the adaptation of the digital solutions. And spearheading the Turkish digital agenda, our companies are also helping to robust digital economy that positions Turkey as a leader in that arena. And with that, I would like to say, YASED takes a pride in its tangible contributions to Turkey's digital transformation. Our association has been instrumental in supporting development of the Turkey's data protection framework, notably through our contributions to Turkey's GDPR registration, where we ensure a good balance between innovation and as well as individual privacy. We have also championed improvements in physical infrastructure, advocating advancements for 5G networks and as well as high-speed internet to create a strong foundation for the digital growth. And furthermore, as YASED is committed to fostering a healthy AI agenda in Turkey, and we are very much encouraged by the constructive and the business-oriented approach of our government counterparts in regulating this emerging field. The efforts of balancing innovation with the security of individuals and institutions and the state are very much aligned with our vision for thriving a digital ecosystem. As we look for the future, YASED remains steadfast in committing to advancing Turkey's digital economy. We firmly believe that a more regulatory environment can accelerate technological progress and position Turkey as a hub for innovation and research. When we look on the global level, we see bold initiatives driving the digital economy forward, such as in the United States, in European Union, in United Arab Emirates, India, and China. Governments are implementing strategies to harness potential of the digital technologies, starting from AI to advanced telecommunication. So as Turkey, we must seize this moment to lead, not to follow. By fostering an environment for investment and innovation, we can attract world's best talent, technology, and ideas, cementing Turkey's role as a global leader in the digital age. In closing, I extend my gratitude to UNCTAD for their continued partnership and for all of you for your dedication and commitment to Turkey's economic future. Today, as we engage with the insights of World Investment Report 2025 and hear from the Head of Investment Research Branch of UNCTAD, Mr. Richard Baldwin, let us all together recommend collaboration, innovation, and bold action. And together, we can ensure that Turkey not only participates in the global digital economy, but also leads it. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and would like to give a floor to Mr. Richard Baldwin, and we are very much interested to hear the outcomes of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tolga Bey. Mr. Baldwin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind words and the introduction. And indeed, it's been quite a few years now that we have had this partnership and have presented and discussed together the annual World Investment Reports with its different annual themes. So happy to be here again. This year's report was just launched this morning by our Secretary General, Ms. Greenspan, here in Geneva. And so it's fresh off the press, and we'll go straight into it. I need to find a way again to present you with some of the slides. And please let me know if I'm succeeding in doing that.
Perfect, we see it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Apologies, I need to find out how I actually move them around.
No worries.
I may need some help on this. It doesn't move on. I will start talking in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we have a global trend in 2024 that doesn't look too rosy. We have an 11% decline in global FDI flows. Most of that decline is driven by negative numbers in Europe and by a decline in China of 29%, and some negative numbers as well in South America. Does anyone manage to to move me along?
No, we are on
this.
Our colleagues are going to guide you, Richard.
Excellent. This is the second year that we have negative growth. We had, of course, if we look at the long-term trend, we had a sort of stagnating trend in the 2010s, a dip during the pandemic. We had very rapid recovery in 21, 22, but 22 reached a peak, and now we are basically already 2 years on a negative trend. If we, I mentioned already the regions that have caused the decline this year, but we also have some compensating numbers. We have very good growth numbers in Africa, 75% increase in FDI in Africa. Unfortunately, for the most part, due to one very, very large project in Egypt, an international project finance deal financed by a UAE sovereign wealth fund.
Okay, Richard, if you can just progress the presentation in your computer as if there is no stream, I think it is going to progress.
Excellent. There we go. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. You're welcome.
So as I mentioned,
yes, that would be great.
Sorry?
If you can just repeat present a slide, that would be
Sure. So I mentioned 11% decline at the global level. And you see on this slide the different components that we look at when we look at FDI, right? So the FDI is the big bucket of international financing, but within that bucket you have different types of projects. You have, of course, the cross-border mergers and acquisitions, but those really mostly affect developed countries, and they're much less relevant in emerging markets and developing countries. In addition, in UNCTAD, we don't find them that interesting because basically they have much less of a development impact, of course. I'm more interested in the projects that you see at the bottom of this slide, which are the greenfield projects, which mostly are concentrated in various industries, from extractives to manufacturing industries to services industry. So these are the greenfield investment project announcements. And then we have the international project finance deals, which mostly affect infrastructure industries. Renewables are a very important part of this, but also the digital infrastructure type industry. So these are the projects that we look at. We see a global negative trend, 11% down for FDI. We see stable project announcements in industries, and we see a very big drop in international project finance. The international project finance drop is one of the major reasons why we see the decline in global FDI. That's mainly due to more difficult financing conditions over the last 2 years, less stability in interest rates and higher interest rates, inflation expectations, and of course debt problems in many emerging markets and developing countries, which affect risk ratings and therefore affect long-term international project finance deals, which have, of course, a very significant debt component. So that's really driven down international project finance around the world. There's almost no country that has any positive figures on international project finance, but it affects countries with higher risk ratings more severely than it affects developed countries. So if we look at the least developed countries, they are very strongly affected by the decline in international project finance. And as we'll see a little bit later in my presentation, it also affects, of course, what we call Sustainable Development Goals relevant investment, SDG investment, because much of that is driven by international project finance. The exceptions are there, of course. I mentioned earlier when I was speaking without slides that we have a big increase in Africa, a big increase in Egypt, and much of that is in fact international project finance, because so much of the investment by institutional investors, by sovereign wealth funds, goes through this modality, right? So that's already a second year of decline in international project finance, and it strongly affects investment around the world. Greenfield investment in industries, much more stable, as you see there, a 3% increase in project numbers, a 5% decline in project values. But in the big picture of international investment, which can see quite some volatility from one year to the next, 3%, 5%, I characterize it as fairly stable results for 2024. Within that, it's interesting to look at different industries, of course. So in greenfield projects, we have several industries that show negative growth, but we have last year we had a rare increase in manufacturing project announcements, and we had a rare increase in supply chain intensive project announcements. And this year we have no increase, but it's remained at that fairly high level achieved last year, which is in the end a very positive result, right? And of course, what we see there is that we have people are now, of course, concerned about what's happening in the first half of this year, with the tariff escalations that we see now, with the enormous uncertainty for investors that we see now, which is likely to affect exactly that type of investment in manufacturing industries that are supply chain or global value chain intensive, right? So. But at least for 2023 and 2024, we had quite positive results there. I will look at that a little bit later when we talk about the prospect for 2025. Mm-hmm. Another area that really showed big growth, of course, both in project finance and in greenfield. So it's the exception industry in project finance, and it is one of the growth industries in greenfield, which is the digital sector, of course, which is one of the reasons why we are addressing that as a special topic in this year's World Investment Report. So while looking at project finance, all infrastructure sectors showed a big decline. Digital infrastructure showed a big increase, and that's both, of course, fibers in the ground, it also telecoms networks, but most of all, it is data centers, right? Data centers are the big growth area for international investment. And values in that area doubled last year, basically. So it's both in the greenfield investment projects and in international project finance. We have digital infrastructure growing, and we have digital services and solutions growing very rapidly, right? So that's the big growth industry. If I then look at the regions, yes, it works. If I look at the distribution of investment in 2024 over income groups and regions, what is the picture, right? So I mentioned earlier that the big drivers of the decline in FDI have been the developed countries, and especially Europe, contrasting very sharply with what we see in North America and the United States. The United States had a 20% increase in FDI last year, right? Whereas developing countries and emerging markets had flat FDI. Of course, within that, between countries, there are enormous differences. And LDCs at the FDI level had actually some growth there. The least developed countries, as we call them in the UN, there's the poorest 40 or so countries in the world. But of course, if you look at the bottom line there, international project finance deals and the trends we see there, we see that exactly in that area, the least developed countries are very strongly affected because they depend so much on that, which will affect their inflows on FDI for the next years to come. I mentioned the interesting contrast between Europe and the United States, perhaps contrary to expectations, right? So what we've seen in the past 2 years in the United States, of course, but also in Europe, is the adoption of industrial policies very much pushing investment in digital infrastructure and pushing investment in green infrastructure, renewable energy, batteries and EV manufacturing have been a big push, of course. In the US, this seems to have driven quite some increase in investment. Although I must remark that a big part of the increase in FDI in the United States was also very high numbers in mergers and acquisitions. So not all of this is fresh investment, right? But a big chunk of it is. The CHIPS Act, for example, seems to have had some effect. If we look at the largest 10 projects around the world, four of the top 10 are semiconductor manufacturing project announcements, and 3 of those were in the United States. Right, so the type of policies that really push for big picture strategic industry investments in the United States, at least, seem to have borne some fruit, right? I mentioned already earlier the differences between regions and between countries. So while developing countries as a whole have a flat picture globally, within that you have a large decline in China of 29%. In fact, if I look at individual country contributions to the global decline, the biggest contribution is, of course, China, because a 29% decline of the second largest recipient in the world is, of course, a very, very big bucket of decline. If you add, you see here on this slide, Europe with a decline by more than half, that is, of course, spread out over many different countries. And it is very much an estimate affected by very volatile financial flows through some of the countries in Europe that have a big conduit role that they play, right? So we try to distill that from the overall impact. So Europe as a group is the biggest part of the global decline, but in individual country terms, China makes a big contribution to that as well. I mentioned already the big increase in Africa, driven mostly by Egypt, but also positive numbers in many other African countries, and especially North Africa. And I mentioned the decline in Latin America, very much concentrated in South America, because some individual countries in Latin America and the Caribbean do show some increase in FDI and do show some increase in project announcements. And especially Central America is, of course, one of those regions that has been benefiting from new manufacturing and supply chain intensive investment as a result of the pressure on multinational enterprises to reconsider locations for production in supply chain intensive industries. And with that, I mean automotive, electronics, machinery and equipment, also textiles, and of course, the more high-tech type export industries. So that's what's happening sector-wise. It's what's happening by income group. It's what's happening by region, right? Here's the picture for Turkey, right? So we have a picture of the overall FDI and project numbers. So FDI inflows, as reported by your central bank, are practically flat. They remain at this level of between 10 and 12 that you have on a yearly basis. But the project numbers for 2024 are not rosy, right? A big decline in international project finance. And here it shows what I said earlier, that you can find very, very volatile flows from one year to the next. So don't be alarmed too much by this 86% decline. This is very few projects, and one project more or less can make a huge difference in international project finance values. Greenfield investment is a bigger concern from where I'm sitting, right? So new announcements in various greenfield investment industrial projects, that is something that as a policymaker in Turkey, I would pay more attention to. I find very interesting the top 5 industries on greenfield projects in 2024, because as you can see, I just listed earlier to you what I consider to be the sort of supply chain intensive industries, and they're all here, right? Motor vehicles, electronics, machinery, they're all here. So while the overall greenfield project numbers or announcements last year were not so positive, at least in terms of the industry composition, it seems that Turkey could be one of those countries that could stand to benefit with good access to European markets from the reconsideration and the restructuring of global supply chains, right? This is really what's going on in the world. Of course, everyone right now picking up today's World Investment Report, what are they going to look at? They're going to look at the increase on investment in the United States and the decrease of investment in China that I just reported, right? What's happening there? And we all know about the last few years, the China Plus and the China Plus Plus strategies that multinational enterprises have been adopting for supply chain intensive manufacturing industries. Companies are looking for additional locations for production, which means that some regions in the world and some countries in the world could have an opportunity to attract some of that investment. When we first started analyzing this a few World Investment Reports ago, what we said was we do not expect an exodus from China, right? It's not like a manufacturing company is going to close its factory in China and set up a shop somewhere else. There's far too much sunk cost in just wanted to give you one slide with all the big numbers for Turkey all in one place. We can discuss about this later on. So it's just one picture. I'll move on to a next picture. Of course, we are the United Nations publishing this report. So for us, what is always very important is what is happening with investment in sustainable development sectors, right? In sustainable development goal sectors. You see them there on the left-hand side. I mentioned this already earlier. Infrastructure, renewable energy, water, sanitation and hygiene, agri-food systems, health and education. You can, just from me reading these sectors out, you already know these are all infrastructure sectors, almost all infrastructure sectors. As a result, they're suffering enormously from the downturn in international project finance. These sectors don't suffer as much, of course, from what's currently going on in terms of global trade tensions, right? Because they're not trading sectors, they're infrastructure sectors. They don't depend on global supply chains, right? So they have nothing to do with that, or very little. They have, of course, to do with geopolitical tensions and risk perceptions and so forth, but much less with trade tensions. And they have much more to do with financing conditions, debt distress in many emerging markets, worsening risk ratings for many countries, very high cost of capital in developing countries and some emerging markets. So that's why these sectors are really, really, really suffering right now. And it is why our Secretary General has continued to push for revisiting mechanisms for risk insurance, mechanisms for investment guarantees, mechanisms for MDB-driven concessional finance to try and bring back international project finance to where it is needed most, right? And this is, of course, very important in light of next week's Financing for Development conference taking place in Seville, where at UN level, intergovernmental meeting, we need to find new ways of reversing this negative trend in international project finance in sustainable development driven sectors. I will skip over the right-hand side of this slide, because I think that in talking earlier, I already talked about all of the industries that are mentioned here. Of course, and this is again on SDG investment, and this is what's happening by sector and by region. Somehow the regions have disappeared. I don't see them on this slide. I don't know why. But what you're looking at here is what is happening in Africa, developing Asia, Latin America, and on the right-hand side there is what you see are the least developed countries. So all the bars on the right-hand side are the least developed countries. And you see there they are suffering most from the decline in sustainable development goals investment, because as I said, they are the most affected by debt distress and by high capital costs, right? So that's where the real suffering is taking place right now, which doesn't directly affect Turkey, but Turkey is one of those countries that in terms of promoting outward investment in recent years has been doing quite a lot, pushing for infrastructure investments in Africa. So I think indirectly for the country and for policymakers in Turkey, this is an important consideration. Prospects. So what can we say about 2025, right? Because now we're all worried. Now we're all worried about what's happening with trade tariffs, especially, right? What you're seeing on this in this table is what we in UNCTAD consider as the most relevant indicators for the prospects of foreign direct investment, right? So at the top there, you see the macroeconomic indicators that are most closely correlated to investment flows going forward. Somewhere around the middle, you see some indices for foreign exchange volatility, stock market, financial market volatility, and so forth, the commodity indices that are really almost like they say something about what is the financial market environment within which investors are making their decisions. The more volatile it is, the more risk-averse people tend to get, right? And the more it becomes difficult to make concrete decisions. Very often, higher volatility indices mean not so much cancellation of investment decisions, but postponement of investment decisions, right? And at the bottom, the last few are very much confidence indicators, Purchasing Managers Index and Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which you see there is skyrocketing right now, right? So this is just a clear indication that since we had the 2024 column is of course actuals, what were they last year? The 25 January is what we thought they would be in January, and then all of the agencies that we have around the world, mostly in this case for the top part, the IMF, but also financial market indicators and Chambers of Commerce doing Purchasing Managers Index, and so for the different agencies have since January, with the new US government in place, updated their assessments, and mostly in the direction that it implicates negative effects for FDI prospects going forward, right? So our assessment in UNCTAD for FDI in 2025 or FDI growth in 2025 is clearly negative. If we look at the first 4 months of data for this year, we see that the deals and project announcements for the first 4 months are at levels not seen since the global financial crisis, record lows. And even if the situation improves over the next few months, it will be very hard to recover what we have missed out on in the first few months of the year. So that it all just leads us to think that there's a lot of downward pressure right now on international investment flows. There are some mitigating factors, right? We have a figure in our report that looks at the earnings, the reported earnings in 2024 reported by the top 5,000 multinational enterprises, and they are still quite high. So, given that so much of FDI is made up of reinvested earnings, naturally that will serve as a stabilizing factor on FDI going forward, right? So that's a stabilizing factor. Some of the inflation outlook is also looking to stabilize right now, so there could be some mitigating factors at play. But the big elephant in the room, of course, is what is happening with tariffs, right? Now, that has basically 2 effects. The main one is the negative effect, which is uncertainty, right? So all of the, I mentioned earlier, we had seen a decade of negative trends in manufacturing investment, more than a decade of negative trends in manufacturing investment, which over the past 2 years, we have seen reverse. So we now finally have upticks for 2 years in manufacturing investment around the world. But of course, that's exactly the type of investment that suffers most from uncertainty when we don't know the tariffs we're going to be paying in our export markets, right? So companies are now sitting on their hands and waiting to see what happens with these tariffs going forward. So that is a big factor, the main factor that will affect aggregate investment, especially in manufacturing, but also certain services industries for 2025. On the other hand, the exact same reason we had over the past 2 years for this uptick in supply chain intensive investment, right? The need for companies to reconsider production locations and to reconsider global supply chains and to look at supply chain resilience around the world are exactly the same reason that it will have exactly the same effects as the tariffs once they are finalized, right? So once we know what the tariffs are going to be, the effect that we've seen over the past 2 years that have led to some opportunities for certain countries, including perhaps Turkey, to attract some supply chain intensive manufacturing investment will be further accelerated by whatever the tariff policies will come in place going forward. So that is our outlook for 2025, mainly negative, some mitigating factors, and some accelerations of pre-existing policy pressures on investment and especially manufacturing investment. That's the outlook going forward. I would conclude here for a moment. I have some more slide material in the backup, but I would leave that for any questions that might emerge from the audience or from yourselves, and for any discussion that we would like to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Tolga, if you have any questions and comments, let's take, or we can just proceed with the questions that are coming from our audience.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would like to thank Richard for this great presentation and super interesting report. I can't hold myself taking notes every slice and everything that you mentioned, Richard. And I think it's a very important and an eye-opener for us. I tried to take out some critical headlines, which is, of course, the next question is what is in for Türkiye? And we see that overall the decline of the FDI, especially for the regions where Turkey has a lot of trades and the business partners, like starting with Europe. So looking about the FDI decline around 11%, which is mainly triggered by Europe, then China, and South America, I think it is really understandable that also there's a decline in Turkey as well. Nevertheless, 2023 and 2024 figures seems to be flat. I believe that it was a big important watch out that you underline regarding about the greenfield investments and a decrease in that area. But on the other side, as the majority and the main reason for this overall decline, and also same for Turkey, is around this international project finance, and which is then triggered by high inflation, FX rates, and predictability. This is very much in line with what we are saying in our narrative as the YASED, that we need to improve the macroeconomic stability and the predictability of the regulatory framework. This is actually one of the core issues that we follow across different areas as YASED, so it is very much overlapping, that we are on the same page from that perspective. And as the 2024 with these figures is not that much of promising, and on top we have these tariff escalations. That's not going to be an easy feature as well for the time being we see, because this uncertainty creates an uneasiness in the investors, which then they act as a conservative, try to keep what they have on hand before they go to the different areas for the investments. So therefore, it's going to be also not a very promising outlook, at least for 2025. But on the other side, I would like to also be taking your further impact of the tariffs. Hopefully, they will settle down at some point of the time. Could be an opportunity for Turkey, for my understanding, at least for the new FDI investments, taking the geopolitical position of Turkey, its engagement to the Europe, and it being sitting in the crossroads of Europe, and as well as developing areas like Egypt and in Africa and the Middle East. So that could be, I think, a potential area to focus to attract more FDIs for the industries that are supply chain incentives. And on the other side, as that is also our focus of today within the digital economy and the digital transformation, focusing on the data centers as a main growth area would be as much as important for setting the digital infrastructure. So therefore, Turkey with its more liberal regulations, much more entrepreneurial actions in these regulations, in that framework, of course, with the right balance of the data privacy and security, but as well as we should seize these opportunities in the data center. So these two areas, I think, would be very important for us to make Turkey much more competitive in attracting existing FDI flows under these challenging conditions, with majority of our focuses in the supply chain incentive industries, and as well as data centers under digital transformation. So that was my takeaways and a short summary, Richard. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Most welcome.
And there's one question coming from the floor about the things that you pointed out, this uneven development that is having a potential to widening the gap between the developing nations and the least developed ones, and also the developed ones. And the digitalization is kind of speeding up the possibilities for this widening gap. So in the report, we immediately noticed that there are some policy proposals for the countries to make the most of it in this digital transformation. We would be really happy if you can just touch upon those so that we can also reassure that we are on the right track to make the most of it in our digital transformation path.
Sure. First of all, and thank you very much for summarizing the insights from my presentation. I think the points you are making are very important to look at. What is the access to the European market? How can we benefit from that? How can we, through that access, try and capture some of this new investment that is trying to find new locations for production? And we've seen some opportunity emerging with an increase in investment in Egypt, and I'm not talking here about the big project finance project, but also industrial investments in Egypt that are driven by this. Morocco is attracting some of this investment from China to export automotive and electronics products to the European market. So in Eastern Europe, there is investment of this nature being pushed. So Turkey is clearly also well positioned to try and capture some of this, right? So, I mean, the type of policy recommendations that we're discussing with countries, and of course we advise, we're the UN, we advise policymakers, so not so much business sector, but the policymakers most of all. And so we're saying there are several things that can be done to either mitigate risks emerging from the current situation in the world with the tariff escalation going on, or that could capture some of the opportunities that we do exist in the market, right? And some of them were just already highlighted in the summary I heard. But one, of course, is there are three factors that determine whether a country can capture some of this supply chain restructuring investment, and they are market access to the major developed markets in the world, in your case Europe. They are good infrastructure links and connections to those markets, and they are the technology and knowledge base that allows you to actually capture some of this investment, and of course the beneficial sort of value and cost considerations that come with that. So that's one, and each of those can be affected by investment policies and can be affected by also investment promotion targets, such as those for transport infrastructure, for example. And that brings me to the second point. If greenfield investment in industry is somehow in distress, but we really need to grow project finance, then we need to really look at that. And that's where probably the efforts for incentives, which tend to be very much focused on pushing employment intensive and export generating type investments, right? In the traditional field of incentives is there, right? Pushing employment and pushing exports, but incentives perhaps could also be strengthened when it comes to bringing back project finance to where it's supposed to be, right? So that's another area. Then we're also looking at for certain countries trying to push investment in sectors that are not so much not machinery and equipment and so forth. And one of those that is growing is the health sector and investment in local production of pharmaceuticals. This is being pushed around the world. There are big policy incentives also pushed by WHO and by individual governments that are stimulating investment in the pharmaceutical industry, and also clustering investments around special economic zones to do exactly that. So that's another area of opportunity that we are seeing. Then there's, of course, a recommendation we have already provided in previous WIRs, which is if global value chains are being affected, then look at regional value chains, look at regional integration, regional cooperation to try and maintain export markets and investment connections. And of course, finally, and that's our bread and butter, of course, continue on the good path that you have already embarked on, which is promoting investment facilitation, making things easier for investors, making rules and regulations for investment transparent, and so forth, right? So that's the big effort taking place in the WTO and with the support of UNCTAD through digital government solutions for that purpose, right? That brings me to your question on the digital part then, right? So we have several recommendations in the report trying to point, it's more of a framework for countries to think, where are the opportunities to promote digital investment, right? Of course, digital investment is driven by very similar FDI determinants that you see in other industries. And it is, where's the big market, right? Well, you have a big enough market for sure, right? Do you have a deregulated digital infrastructure sector? And that is a very, very important determinant for digital infrastructure investment. And that includes, as I said, fiber in the ground and wireless infrastructure, internet exchange points, and so forth, but also data centers, of course, right? So market and transparently regulated digital infrastructure industries. I think those are the key elements. Of course, there's other recommendations in the report that are geared more to the global community, because of course at UN level last year, the UN Secretary General adopted with member states the Digital Compact with new objectives for digital development around the world. I think you're a bit beyond that. This is very much aimed at least developed countries, lower income countries. But of course, much of the UNCTAD recommendations in this are geared towards that.
Thank you so much. And also, we are following the speeches of Ms. Greenspan and her emphasis on regaining the long-term perspective in the incent investments, apart from the strategic choices driven by the global developments. That is going to be the challenge, as we also perceive. There is one question asking for your comment. It's about the outputs of the report. The investments, the FDI in US is increasing. The China is slightly decreasing, but when you consider the amount of it, it is still a big chunk of FDI. But the slowdown in Europe is kind of a concern for Turkey, as it's our main market, and our trade relations are directly infected by any change. The change ratio is so high. And what are your comments for the first 6 months of 2025 compared to the performance of EU in the last year?
Yeah, I think we should not be too worried, and your audience should not be too worried looking at the big decrease number for Europe for last year, right? It is a distorted picture, right? The reason I'm saying that is that so much of the balance of payment statistics that is FDI, right? FDI is part of the balance of payments, are distorted by financial flows that really have nothing to do with the creation of new productive investment, right? This is especially the case in Europe, right? So if I look at if I look at the FDI numbers for the major markets in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, they're all extremely negative, right? But if we look at what is the reason for that, is that intra-company loans are very, very low or negative, right? And then I see, in contrast, very, very big increases in places like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Belgium, the UK, Ireland, and so forth. I don't think I need to explain to you what is happening here, right? So these are very much intra-firm financial flows or financial transactions to rejig financing structures of European multinational networks, in part, a small part pushed by supply chain restructuring, but really it's not that productive. It's really very much driven by the new directives for the implementation of international tax reforms and by internal considerations and transactions, one-off transactions of European multinationals. So don't stare yourself blind on that 58% negative number for Europe. It's really not that important from the perspective of the creation of productive capacity or real investment trends. I think that the negative number, the minus 29% for China, and think about it, it's the second year in a row that we have that number. So by now we have, compared to the peak year in China, we have 40% lower numbers in China. Is from a productive FDI perspective far more important than the negative numbers in Europe. So in addition, if I think about this, I mean, both firms producing in China and firms considering Europe as an investment location find themselves with Turkey in the middle as a potential location to export to the European markets, right? So I would not be too worried about lower investment numbers in Europe, and I would really think about what is happening in terms of the shift that's taking place by global multinationals, both Chinese and elsewhere, right? Where are they going to make their investments going forward? We see 10% increase in investment in ASEAN. We see over the last 3 years, every year for 3 years in a row, manufacturing investment from China in ASEAN has increased by a third. 1/3 more, 1/3 more, 1/3 more, right? Enormous investment activity to build manufacturing capacity elsewhere, right? Some countries are now the victim of that. Vietnam, one of them, for example. So you need policymakers need to also be quite careful in what you wish for. But it just is a big indication of how big is the opportunity that can exist for certain markets, right, to attract some of this restructuring, supply chain restructuring investment, right? And I mentioned the criteria that I think are most important: market access, and sort of FTA treaties and so forth, infrastructure links, and technology and knowledge base to actually attract the investment.
Thank you very much. And Tolga Bey, if you don't have any other comments, we may conclude the session.
Yes,
and Richard, please
go ahead.
Please. Thank you very much for being with us today and your valuable insights. And please extend our thanks to your team and also our appreciation. And to Ms. Greenspan, I hope you will be happy to host her and your team in one of our events in Istanbul. And until then, take care. And Tolga Bey.
Thank you very much, Richard. We truly appreciate it. This was a great presentation and very insightful report. And it truly gives us lots of perspective and reference points for us to move forward. So we know that you have a very busy agenda, as the report is just literally published. So we truly appreciate for your time and your attention to us. And I would like to also thank you very much, everyone who participated online for this session. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.